Persuasive speaking is very strategic. It's very intentional. And it's not just about researching and finding information, but then how do we organize that? How will my audience process that? Anticipating what they might think and answering those questions in your presentation so that you can help your audience be more receptive to your messages. And so this video is going to cover the overview of persuasive strategies. One of those strategies is Aristotle's methods of persuasion, which are ethos, pathos, and logos, but that's a lot to cover in one session. So this video is going to go over just ethos and pathos, which is credibility and emotion. And then the third video will go over logos, which is argumentation, fallacies, and then we'll briefly work on conclusions. There are a lot of different persuasive strategies, and I noticed the bottom is cut off a little bit on this video, but the PowerPoint itself, which you can access directly, should be fine. Aristotle is the father of persuasion. He would teach people to defend themselves in court because back in his day there weren't attorneys. And so he argues that ethos, pathos, and logos are essential components to strong persuasion or rhetorical proof. He wrote a book called The Rhetoric. It's the first sort of communication book that we have. It is a difficult read. We got to that in graduate school. So it's not my first choice of reading material, but great strategies. And so you will be intentionally using those in your speeches. Okay. There are other persuasive strategies, and I have them listed here. Cognitive dissonance, which is not in our book, but when an audience doesn't like what they're hearing, they already have a different thought on the subject, they are resistant to hearing what you have to say. They often tune out. But a good speaker will help move the audience away from that. So if you happen to be a smoker in our campus, which we used to have smoking on campus, used to allow that. And so when the new rule was passed, no smoking on campus, obviously anybody who smokes is upset with that. So if we were listening to speeches on why we should or shouldn't have that, if somebody was advocating we shouldn't allow smoking on campus and you're a smoker, you would be experiencing cognitive dissonance. And as a good persuasive speaker, I would recognize that and I would address that. And while I would prefer a non-smoking campus, I recognize the need, the addiction, and the right that you actually have to smoke. So personally, I would argue that we would create outdoor smoking areas that I could easily move away from the smoke and you would still have the ability to smoke, because the problem is that the smokers were smoking right outside the doors to buildings and then the non-smokers would have to breathe. So in order to try to include everybody, I would argue that we would just be strategic about smoking areas. And then as a listener, you would be more likely to maybe hear what else I have to say because I'm trying to move you away from your position. I'm also trying to sort of be a little bit neutral here too. You can use positive or negative motivation. Good things happen to people if you do what I argue and what I'm advocating, and bad things will happen to you. There's consequences that if you don't believe me, here's what could happen. And those are okay. And there's some rules that are associated with that. You'll see that in just a few moments. We're going to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you're trying to reach an audience, look at their needs and how can you meet their needs is a great strategy. We have a separate slide on that coming up. And then in other classes or papers, when you're dealing with opposing views, there's a couple of rules of thumb, and in a normal standard semester, oftentimes I have you do these controversial issues or topics, but not this semester. You have to be fair. You are speaking to people in the audience who don't hold your viewpoint. And so you don't want to insult or you don't want to bash. That is never, I think, appropriate. You see a lot of that in politics, and that is one of my pet peeves. You still need to be appropriate and effective to be an appropriate and a competent communicator. And if you want to reach your audience, name calling your constituents is not a good idea. And it's done on both sides of the aisle. And so we don't want to insult, we don't want to bash. I also think that's appropriate, a guideline for social media. If you're bashing or you're insulting, I wouldn't post it. I wouldn't. That's me. It is fine to explain how there's weaknesses on the other side, and here's and it's okay to talk about the validity of their side too. Nobody is usually 100% wrong. So it's okay and even very credible for you as a speaker to suggest that while the other side has great ideas and great approaches, that you found something that you think is better or more efficient or newer. And it's okay to say, here's a weakness, and I would disagree with you because here's what the other side says, here's what I would say, here's why my position is stronger, better, newer, whatever. So there's a strategic way to appropriately discuss opposing viewpoints, but most students forget, and I always play devil's advocate, that I'm sitting in the audience and chances are I disagree with you. And so they'll flat out tell me how the other side is stupid. And I'm like, really? You just insulted me to my face. Hello, you have to assume there are people in your audience that disagree with you, and you cannot insult them to their face. You have to be appropriate and effective. And I know sometimes that's hard, especially when emotions are strong. But there are appropriate ways to address the other side. Again, we're not doing that in this class, although you do have a written assignment that you're working on for that. All right, so for Aristotle, ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, super simple, easy to process, although sometimes you'll think it means emotion because E is for ethos and emotion starts with an E, but that does not work in this case. Ethos is establishing credibility. You already know a little bit about that. In persuasion, it's even more important that you are credible. If you give lots of information and you don't give any research to back it up, you have low credibility, right? And so it's important for you to be a credible speaker. And so we, as an audience, are going to look at, do you sound competent? Do you know your material? What about your character? Were you, not so pleasant on discussion boards? Your audience already has a perception of you. They look at character. They ask, are you trustworthy? They like a dynamic and charismatic speaker. If you're wishy-washy or ho-hum or, well, it would sure be nice if everybody could get along. Well, yes, it would, but that's not persuasive, and you don't sound credible. So you need to have some energy and strength and passion for what your subject is. You got to have some of that energy to show that you're interested, and then we're more likely to be responsive. But when it comes to credibility, we break it down a little bit further. There's initial, first impressions. Derived is what you earn during a speech, and final, or sometimes called terminal, but I like final better, is the ending. Like, you could have a great speech, but if you have lousy closing remarks, you're going to fall flat. You're going to lose credibility. We're going to have a letdown at the end of your speech. So you really need to have a strong ending. So we have first impressions of you. Let's assume that's good. Let's say you messed up and you are frustrated at the moment. How do you derive credibility? How can you gain credibility back if you mess up during your speech? Usually the audience doesn't really know you mess up because they don't have your outline. They haven't seen your visuals. Nobody knows where you're going except for what you've already told them. So most of the time they don't know. But how can you earn it back? Okay, so good delivery skills, making sure you're citing your research, making sure you're organized and you have clear transitions, that you're energetic. Those are all ways to gain credibility back. So never panic if something goes wrong. Take a breath, keep going, and then rev it up, right? Get back in with the energy and acting confident even though you don't feel like it, so you can reestablish that credibility. It doesn't mean that it's over. Okay, so that is ethos, credibility. Pathos is connecting to your audience emotionally. Audiences usually respond very well to emotion. And it usually doesn't stand really well on its own. Usually you combine emotion with more of the statistics and the facts. So that's a really good strategy, actually, is by combining both of those together. So if you're using statistics, etc., or you're using emotion, I would try to have the other component nearby. Okay, so emotion and logic together are stronger, which is why we want ethos, pathos, and logos in your speeches. So combine your logical appeals, use emotion rousing verbal messages, right? That descriptive language, your stories or illustrations, be very descriptive, paint the word pictures, your nonverbal messages like tone of voice, your eye contact or your lack of eye contact, that can affect your message. Images can be very powerful. They have to be appropriate. If you use images that are graphic, you have to provide a disclaimer letting the audience know that what they're about to see might be gory and scary and that they can look away. And then you need to tell them when they look back. If you show an image that is considered gory or not very appropriate without a disclaimer, that is a big no-no. You will lose points for that for sure. So you can motivate with fear. So some of the times those are those negative appeals, but it has to be perceived to your audience as a threat to the family members, or it has to be perceived as real because a lot of young adults feel invincible. So motivating them with fear sometimes is very difficult. And you have to be a credible speaker yourself in order for that to work. If you don't have strong credibility, fear appeals usually do not work. Motivating with positive appeals. Good things will happen to you if you agree with me, if you do what I'm advocating, if you participate, etc. And so those are also usually based on emotion. And then you can use people's needs to reach them emotionally. Some of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You'd get that in psychology or sociology. So let's take a look at how that looks and works as we finish up how to use pathos. Abraham Maslow suggests that we all have needs and that there's a hierarchy. And the most foundational needs are at the bottom of the pyramid, the physiological needs. And that all the other needs that are above that are important, but only once the physical needs are met. If you are lacking in the physiological needs, then we're not so concerned with, good hair day and self-esteem. You need food or you need air, right? You need to breathe, right? And so what happens is when you are talking to an audience, figure out what kinds of needs do they have that I can relate to with my topic. There was, I heard a speech on indoor air pollution. Well, we have a need for clean air and breathing. And so that appealed to physiological needs. When you look at security systems or the doorbells, right, with the camera doorbells, right, that they're arguing about safety and security. That's part of their trying to meet your needs, right? And so how can you meet their needs? And so you can apply that intentionally in your speeches. They don't all apply, but you would pick and choose. You're trying to advocate working together with people, then that would allow them meet their need for love and belonging. Okay, and so we want to think through that. How can I inspire or motivate you? Maybe it's meeting some of your needs. How can I get you to buy my product? Meeting some of your needs. Okay, so as you're putting together your speeches, you'll want to come back and review, how do I reach people emotionally and what can I put into my speech that will reach people emotionally? Same thing with logos. Okay. So Stay tuned for our last video on logic, errors in reasoning, which are called fallacies, and conclusions.